App developers can rapidly speed up their development by using Flutter, which is a cross-platform UI framework. Just like with everything though, you can use Flutter to enhance your coding experience or to completely undermine it. Not managing your state is one of the main sins of software development, and Flutter is no different. Simply said, if you put your fields all over the place, you are going to end up with a huge mess in your code. Flutter is really awesome because it gives you absolute freedom in how you can manage the state, and it's up to you to decide on the particular technique. And I feel like the BLoC pattern, which stands for Business Logic Component, is a perfect fit for Flutter, and that's why you are going to learn the basics of it in this tutorial. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, and let's learn how to make this really simple app using the BLoC pattern, where we will be basically just adding stuff on top of the default counter app with which you are probably all familiar because it comes with every single new Flutter project that you create. And in a normal counter app you have only this increment button, but we are going to add also the decrement button for the number. And yeah, it's going to be all done through the BLoC pattern. We have basically two choices on how to deal with the BLoC pattern. We can use the low-level stuff, which is basically vanilla Flutter, so to say, by using stream controllers, streams, and sinks. And that's how we are going to implement the BLoC in this particular tutorial, which means that we are going to implement it all ourselves, but it's going to be pretty simple. Then there is also an awesome BLoC library which helps us manage the complexity of the BLoC by creating some abstractions and hiding the code behind the BLoC behind some really nicely named classes and functions. I feel like that in order to understand the library, you first have to understand the underlying implementation. So that's why in this first tutorial, you're going to learn everything from scratch. If you haven't yet installed Flutter, you can go to Flutter.io, also the link is in the video description, and there is an awesome tutorial on how to set everything up, whether you are on Windows, Mac or Linux. So just go through it and you are going to end up with a new Flutter project which will look something like this one. We can immediately launch it by hitting F5 if you are using Visual Studio Code. And the app is going to look like this. It has only the increment button and it increments, how else, the number. What we want to do first is to get rid of these obnoxious comments. So just hit Ctrl F in Visual Studio Code. We want to replace everything which is behind two slashes, which signifies a comment. So / and then dot and asterisk. And also make sure to enable regex, and now just we want to replace it with blank space, so just replace everything. And once we have that, we can hit Shift Alt F to format it with Dart formatter, and the code will be nice. As the first thing, let's modify the UI because we want to have another button for decrementing the counter. So let's add it all the way down here. We have a floating action button set up inside the scaffold, and the floating action button is of type widget. So it doesn't actually need to be a floating action button itself, it can be any kind of widget. For that reason, we are going to wrap this floating action button with a row, so hit Ctrl and dot, and we want to wrap it with a row. Rows put their children besides each other horizontally. So because we want to have those two floating action buttons beside each other on the horizontal axis, we put them inside a row. Now we want to add another floating action button in here, so we are just going to copy all of this and paste it below. Let's check out how it looks when we save it. And it looks something like this, which is not all that cool. First, let's modify the button, which should be for decrementing, by changing its tooltip to say decrement, and also the icon should be icon remove, not add. Now if we take a look at it, it's going to look a bit better, but still the alignment is pretty bad. We can align these two buttons to the right of the screen by using a main axis alignment on the row itself. And main axis alignment is alignment along the main axis, which in the case of the row, it's the horizontal axis. So we want to align it on the horizontal axis towards the end of it. So when we hit save, now the two buttons are going to be positioned somewhat nicely, but still they are too close to each other. And for that reason, we need to put some spacing in between them. And we can do that with a sized box. And this sized box will have a width of 10 density independent pixels, or how else are they called in Flutter. I come from Android, so I don't really know all of the Flutter terminology just yet, but basically what this will do is that they will be spaced out nicely. Alright, but now we have a bit of a problem because the plus button increments and the minus button also decrements, and I'm not even speaking of the fact that we still aren't managing state through the block pattern. But first, before implementing the block, we should probably have a functioning app with the old-fashioned state in your widgets kind of way. For that, let's look at how the counter is incremented. We can see that on the increment button, floating action button, we have an onPressed property, and this is calling increment counter. If we hit F12, which takes us to its definition, it takes us to the top of our home page state, where there is a simple function which calls setState, and then it increments counter inside that setState. Whenever a setState is called, the underlying widget tree is rebuilt, and because it's rebuilt and the counter is already incremented, the number will be incremented on the screen. Flutter works a lot like game engines, which basically render new content on the screen periodically, but in the case of Flutter, it doesn't do that periodically, like every second, 60 times per second, right? But it does that only when you call setState. So now we have a good idea on how to implement decrement counter. So we can just basically copy this function and call it a decrement counter, and only change the ++ to be a decrementation of the counter. And now we can go down to our floating action button for decrementing, and instead of increment counter, we can call or pass in the decrement counter. Now when we save this and go back to our app, it's going to be working just properly. Incrementation works and decrementing also works. If your whole state consists of a single variable, as it is in our case, because we have only the counter integer here, then it's probably just fine to manage your state like we are doing now through setState and having the state directly inside the widget. However, as soon as you add some APIs, some databases and all of that, and as soon as you need to parse some JSON data and then output it as Dart objects, you are probably not gonna wanna have the state directly inside your Flutter managed widgets or whatever else is managed by Flutter, like for example, this state object. One of the biggest problems of app development is that you have spaghetti code, which means that you have everything all over the place, and after a while you don't even know where something is. You have to search for it for ages. When you change something, it's going to break everything down. You cannot test your app because it's written in such a complicated way that testing is impossible. So we need to have some kind of a way to separate our state from the UI. For that, as you can probably anticipate, we can use a block, and a business logic component is basically a box where events come in from one side and the state comes out from the other side. The basic concept is that events go in and the state goes out, and the block just operates on these events to basically figure out which state it should output. That's a bit of an abstract description, so let's look at it in practice. First up, we are going to create the events which will come into the block, and the block will then figure out what to output. We have two basic events, one for incrementing the counter and the other one for decrementing the counter. So we want to create a new file under the lib folder, and we are going to call it counter event.dart. Inside it, we want to have an abstract class counter event. And also, I should probably mention that you can get the code from this tutorial by going to the link in the video description, which is going to take you to risocoder.com. So if you don't want to type everything out, you can just get the code and look at it at your own pace. This counter event is the base class from which all of the subsequent increment events and decrement event will inherit. That takes us to the increment event, which will look basically like this. It's a completely empty class. It just extends the counter event. And then we also want to have decrement event. And that's about it. These two events are going to be passed into the block. Now let's create the file in which the counter block will be situated, and it's going to be created under the lib folder. And how else? It's going to be called counter block. It's also going to be a class. We first want to import Dart async, which enables us to use stream controllers, syncs, and also streams. I'm gonna explain what they do in just a bit. And then also we want to import our counter event, which we have just created. First, we want to have the actual counter variable inside of here. So just simple int counter, and we are going to set it to be 0 by default. Then, next up, we are going to create a state controller, which will be a stream controller. And what is this counter state controller going to do? As you can first notice, this counter state controller is private because it has this underscore before the name. And then also the sync is private, but the stream is public. You can think of the stream controller as of a box which has two holes, one for input and another one for output. The one for input is also called a sync, and the output is called a stream. Whenever there is some input to the sync, it's going to be automatically outputted through the stream. In our case, we are going to put numbers inside this encounter sync, and those same numbers are going to come out from the stream. And we are making only this stream which outputs data public because we only want our widgets to be listening to the output of the counter state controller. Alright, so we can already listen to the value of the counter through this counter stream, but we also need to have a way for our UI to input the events for decrementing or incrementing the counter. So how are we going to do that? Well, we are going to create another stream controller, but this one will only expose a sync. This second stream controller is called counter event controller, and the sync is counter event sync. Our UI will put events, so increment event or decrement event, into this sync. You may say that, alright, that's all nice, but you previously said that a block is like a box where events come in and the state comes out. So we need to basically somehow connect this event sync with the counter stream so that events come in from this sync and the counter value comes out from this counter stream. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can listen to the counter event controller, this one, stream. So inside the constructor of the counter block, we are going to listen to the output of the counter event stream. And the counter event controller's stream is going to output whatever is input to it through this sync. So when our UI inputs an increment event, this increment event will be output through the stream, and then we can listen to it. And then subsequently we can map this event to a new state, which is a simple function which will basically accept an event. And then if that event is increment event, we want to increment the counter. If it is not, so therefore it's decrement event, we want to decrement the counter. And then next up, really important, we want to add the new counter value to the sync of our counter state controller. And that will make sure that it gets output through its stream, because remember, state controller, this counter state controller of type stream controller, is also like a box where values come in through the sink and they also come out through the stream. So just to recap a bit, you can see that our UI gets exposed to only two properties here. One is the counter stream, which outputs stuff, and the another one is the counter event sink, which inputs events. And let's also not forget about the really important dispose function, because dispose will close our stream controllers, and this is really important because otherwise you are going to get memory leaks. I know that this may seem a bit bloated for the things that we are doing with the BLoC, but the BLoC pattern is really useful for when you are having some more state in your app, and also if you use the library and not do it yourself, or if you make some kind of abstractions yourself by not using these stream controllers but somehow hiding them behind nicer names, you're going to find out that the BLoC pattern is really simple, really performant, and really powerful. But anyway, what's left to do now for us is to implement the UI. So let's jump back to the main.dart file. We are going to get rid of the two functions for incrementing and decrementing, and also of the counter itself. We are going to create a final block, which is gonna be equal to a new counter block, and hit Ctrl and dot to import this counter block here. In a real more complex app, you would create this counter block in one place and then pass it down the widget tree through inherited widget, but because we don't have a complex widget tree, we don't need to do that, so we can just reference this BLoC property directly from here. Alright, now here where we have the column, we want to cut that out from here for a while, and we are going to paste it in later, but this child should now be a stream builder. So stream builder like this. You can either write it out yourself or just write stb and then hit enter if you have the snippets VS Code plugin installed and the plugin is called Awesome Flutter Snippets, so definitely install it because it has a lot of time-saving stuff inside of here. Anyway, now the stream that we want to listen to is the block.counter stream, and also block is private, so don't forget to add the underscore before it. Initial data will be 0, then we can also indicate that this async snapshot will hold an integer value. And now we can just remove this container, and instead we want to return the column which we have just cut from this file, and then now we are pasting it back. Also format the code, so Shift-Alt-F. And instead of displaying counter here, we want to display whatever is inside the snapshot, so snapshot.data. The core takeaway from this is that Stream Builder is a really nice widget which enables you to work with streams really efficiently. There's still one thing left, and that is to pass the events into our BLoC, and this can happen through the unpressed properties of our floating action buttons. So instead of calling increment counter, we want to call a new anonymous function, and that one will call BLoC dot. We want to get the counter event sync, and we want to add to that sync, and we want to add an increment event and also import that class. And then also similarly, what we want to do in the unpressed of the decrement floating action button is that we want to call add, but this time we want to add a decrement event. Alright, and now if we do a full restart, so Ctrl F5 just to be safe, come back to the app, and now increment and decrement, it all works. And we can see that it's going through the BLoC, because when we put a breakpoint over here, for example right here, and we increment, we're going to hit the breakpoint, so we know that we are doing everything properly. Oh, and also one thing that I forgot here is to add the dispose function, so we want to override dispose. So just write this and it's going to add it, and then inside this dispose we want to call block.dispose, because otherwise we are actually not going to get rid of those stream controllers, so we are going to get memory leaks, but now we aren't going to get them, so that's all. Alright, and that's it for this tutorial. If you don't want to miss more tutorials from Flutter and also the Flutter tutorial in which we will be using the BLoC library instead of building the BLoC ourselves, definitely subscribe to this channel and also hit the bell button so that you're not going to miss any of my new videos. If this video helped you, definitely give it a like and also share it. If you have anything to say, leave it in the comments, follow me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, and see you in the next video.